The morning Reverend Elias Cobb pointed his bony finger at Myrtle Holloway and declared her unfit for holy matrimony. The whole congregation of Harlan Creek, Texas held its collective breath. All except one man in the back pew who stood up slowly, adjusted the brim of his hat and said, "I beg to differ, preacher." It was the autumn of 1882, and the town of Harlan Creek sat nestled in the dry hills of West Texas like a seed caught between two stones, half alive and half forgotten. The railroad had come through 2 years prior, bringing with it a surge of settlers, cattle buyers, and the particular brand of self-righteous men who believed God had appointed them to sort the worthy from the unworthy. Reverend Elias Cobb was chief among them. He had built the whitewashed church on the corner of Main and Sycamore with money donated by the respectable families of the town, and he had wielded that pulpit like a gavel ever since. Myrtle Holloway was 26 years old, with dark auburn hair that refused to stay pinned, a pair of steady gray eyes that had seen more hardship than most women twice her age, and a jaw set in a way that suggested she had decided long ago to stop apologizing for being alive. She had come to Harlan Creek 3 years earlier from the wreckage of a life in Abilene, where her husband, a gambler and a liar named Cecil Holloway, had drunk himself to death and left her with nothing but a modest debt and a last name that felt like a stone around her neck. She had arrived in Harlan Creek with $40, a sewing case, and a determination to build something honest. She had done just that. She took in mending and alterations, then built a small but respectable dressmaking business out of a rented room above the hardware store. She paid her bills on time. She kept to herself. She helped Mrs. Alderton when the old woman broke her hip and could not manage her own household for 6 weeks. She was not a woman who courted trouble. Trouble had simply always known where to find her. The particular trouble that arrived in the autumn of 1882 began when Thomas Greer, a widower with 2 young sons and a prosperous wheat farm 6 miles north of town, came calling with his hat in his hand and a respectable proposal on his lips. He was 41 years old, mild-mannered and genuinely lonely, and he thought Myrtle Holloway was the kind of woman who could help put his household back together. She had agreed to consider it. She had not yet agreed to anything else. But in a town like Harlan Creek, agreement was beside the point. The moment Thomas Greer had been seen speaking to Myrtle at the general store 3 Saturdays in a row, the entire town had drawn its own conclusions, and Reverend Cobb had been given what he considered sufficient cause to intervene. He chose to do it on a Sunday morning in October, with the whole congregation assembled, and the air inside the church smelling of linseed oil and dried flowers. He did not call Myrtle out by name at first. He circled around it the way a buzzard circles a carcass, speaking broadly about the dangers of men entrusting their children and their homes to women of uncertain character. He spoke about the sanctity of marriage. He spoke about the importance of choosing a helpmate who was whole in spirit and clean in reputation. And then he said it plainly. "There is a woman in this town," he said, his voice rolling out like a slow wagon wheel, "who has been entertaining the attentions of one of our most upstanding members. And I tell you plainly as your shepherd that this woman is not fit to be a wife. She has been married before. Her first husband came to a disgraceful end. She has lived alone, without family, without proper supervision, for 3 years in this community, and I will not stand at this altar and join her to any man in this congregation. She is too broken, too scarred by the life she has lived, to be given the honor of holy matrimony in this house of God." Every head in the church turned. Some turned to look at Myrtle Holloway, who sat 3 rows from the front, her back straight as a fence post, and her hands folded in her lap with a stillness that cost her everything she had. Some turned away because decent people could not quite bear to look. Thomas Greer, sitting in the second row with his 2 young boys, stared at his own boots, and from the very back of the church in the last pew on the left side, Ira Ashford stood up. He was 34 years old, broad across the shoulders, with dark brown hair gone a little long beneath a weather-beaten hat, and the kind of face that had been worked on by sun and wind and honest worry until it had become something strong and particular. He ran the Ashford cattle operation, 3,000 acres of good pasture land southeast of town, with a crew of 6 men, and a reputation for being fair and plain-spoken. He attended church every Sunday because his mother had raised him to, and because he believed in the general idea of it, though he had grown increasingly doubtful about Reverend Cobb specifically. He had not planned to stand up. He had not planned to speak. But he had sat in that back pew listening to a man with a Bible in his hand strip the dignity from a woman who had never done him a single harm, and something in him had simply refused to remain seated. "I beg to differ, preacher," he said again, louder this time, because the first time had been more to himself than anyone else. The room went so quiet that you could hear the October wind pushing against the windows. Reverend Cobb turned very slowly, the way powerful men turn when they are surprised to find someone standing behind them. "Brother Ashford," he said carefully. "I've sat in this church for 3 years," Ira said, walking forward between the pews, unhurried and deliberate, the way he walked when he was absolutely certain of his direction. "I've listened to you preach on mercy and on grace and on the love of God for the broken and the lost. I believed you meant it." He stopped at the center aisle where he could be seen by everyone. "But what I just heard you say about Myrtle Holloway was not mercy, and it wasn't grace, and I don't believe God had a thing to do with it." Cobb's face went a deep, alarming red. "Brother Ashford, this is a pastoral matter, and I suggest you. This woman lost her husband," Ira said, his voice even and carrying. "She came to this town with nothing, and she built something honest. She has not lied to anyone, stolen from anyone, or wronged anyone in this community that I have ever heard of. You are standing at that pulpit calling her broken like that is a sin, and I am telling you that it is not." He paused. He was not a man who used more words than he needed, but he was a man who chose the ones he used with great care. "You will not speak about her that way again." He did not look at Myrtle when he said it. He was not speaking to her. He was speaking to the room. And then he turned, walked back down the aisle, and let himself out through the front doors of the church into the sharp October morning. The congregation did not quite know what to do with that. Neither did Myrtle Holloway. She sat in her pew until the service ended, which Reverend Cobb conducted in a state of tight-lipped fury that made the whole thing shorter than usual. Then she rose, walked out with her chin level, and did not stop until she was back in her room above the hardware store, where she sat down on the edge of her bed and stared at the wall for a long time. She had been angry during the sermon. A deep, carefully contained anger that she had held like a coal in a closed fist, because she knew from long experience that a woman showing anger in public only ever made things worse for herself. She had not let herself feel the fear underneath it until she was alone. The fear that Cobb was right, not in any moral sense, not in any way she believed, but in the practical, grinding sense that in a town like Harlan Creek, a preacher's condemnation was a thing you could not easily recover from. She had not expected anyone to say what Ira Ashford had said. She did not know quite what to do with it. The following Monday she was in the dry goods store selecting buttons when she heard the bell above the door and looked up to find him standing there, turning his hat in his hands with a manner that suggested he was slightly less certain of himself in a store than he was in a church. "Miss Holloway," he said. "Mr. Ashford," she replied. He came to the counter where she stood and set his hat down beside a bolt of blue calico. He looked at her directly, which she appreciated, because most people in town had been looking at her sideways since Sunday. "I want to make sure yesterday didn't cause you more trouble than it fixed," he said. "I wasn't trying to make a scene. I just couldn't sit there and not say something." "What made you say it?" she asked. She was not ungrateful. She was genuinely curious, the way she always was about the mechanics of why people did the things they did. He thought about it for a moment. "I kept thinking, what if that were my sister sitting in that pew, my mother, any woman I cared about?" He paused. "And then I thought it didn't actually matter whether I knew you or not. what he was saying was wrong. The kind of wrong you don't get to be quiet about. Myrtle looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly conversational. "Well," she said finally, "thank you for that. I'd also like to ask if I could call on you," he said, with a directness that was almost startling. "Not out of sympathy. I want to be plain about that. I've been aware of you since you came to Harlan Creek, and I have thought well of what I've observed. I never thought I had cause to approach you before." He picked up his hat. "Now I figure I've already said the hardest thing I was ever going to say in front of that particular crowd, so I might as well say this too." Myrtle stared at him. And then, despite everything, she laughed. It was not a polite, measured laugh. It was a real one that surprised even her, and it made something in his expression ease in a way that she noticed and filed carefully away. "You can call on me," she said. "Thursday, if that suits you." He said Thursday suited him fine, replaced his hat on his head, and walked out with the particular dignity of a man who has done what he came to do. She watched him go through the store window and then turned back to her buttons and found that she was still smiling. The town, meanwhile, was having a vigorous conversation about all of it. Harlan Creek was not a large place, perhaps 400 souls within the town proper and another few hundred scattered across the surrounding range and farmland, and it had the particular quality of small places everywhere, which is that everyone's business eventually belonged to everyone. By Monday evening, the story of Ira Ashford standing up in church had traveled the length of Main Street and back again, gathering details and interpretations with every retelling. Reverend Cobb was furious. He was a man who had never been publicly contradicted in his own church, and he found the experience unacceptable. He paid a call on Monday afternoon to Harold Finch, who owned the largest ranch north of town and sat on the church council, and he expressed his view that Ira Ashford had been disrespectful and disruptive to the order of the congregation. Harold Finch, who was a practical man, listened to this, and then said mildly that in his opinion, Brother Ashford had raised a fair point, and that perhaps the sermon had been somewhat indelicate. Cobb left Finch's house in a worse temper than he had arrived. He also paid a call on Thomas Greer, who told him, with the quiet exhaustion of a man who had not slept in 2 days, that he had been thinking it over and he did not believe he was ready to court anyone yet, and that perhaps he had been moving too quickly. This was possibly true, and it was also the act of a man who had discovered that the water was deeper than he had realized and had decided to step back from the edge. Myrtle Holloway, when she heard this news secondhand, felt primarily relieved. She had not been sure how to tell Thomas Greer gently that she had agreed to consider his proposal and not to accept it, and that there was a difference. Ira arrived at her door on Thursday evening at precisely 7 o'clock, which she appreciated. He carried a small bundle of late-season wildflowers, not the florid, showy kind, but the sturdy, unpretentious ones that still bloomed along the creek banks in October, purple and gold. And he had cleaned up with the careful attention of a man who respected the occasion, without being precious about it. She had made coffee and there was a plate of shortbread on the table, and they sat across from each other in her small, tidy sitting room and talked. They talked for 3 hours. She told him about Abilene, more than she had told most people, because he asked questions that were genuinely interested and not prurient, and because he listened in a way that suggested he was actually hearing what she said rather than waiting for her to finish so he could speak. He told her about his family, his mother, who had died 4 years ago, and his younger brother Marcus, who helped run the ranch, and his father, who had come to Texas from Virginia before the war and built the Ashford operation from 160 acres and a handful of cattle into what it was today. He told her that the ranch was his life's work and his great love, and he said it without apology, the way people say true things. He told her that he had almost married once 7 years ago, a woman named Clara from San Antonio, but that she had eventually decided she did not want the life that came with a working cattle ranch, and they had parted ways without any great violence, just a mutual recognition that they wanted different things. Do you still think about her? Myrtle asked, because she was not a woman who avoided direct questions when she wanted direct answers. "Sometimes," he said honestly. "The way you think about a road you didn't take, not with regret exactly. More with curiosity about where it might have gone." She nodded. She understood that kind of wondering. When he stood to leave and put his hat on, he paused at the door. "I'd like to come again Sunday if you're willing. Not to church," he added. "We can go for a ride. I'd like to show you the land." "I'd like that," she said. He nodded, and his smile was slow and particular and somehow different from his public face, warmer and less guarded, and she filed that away too. Reverend Cobb conducted the following Sunday's sermon on the topic of keeping the company of upright Christians and avoiding those who would lead a soul astray. He did not name names. He did not need to. Everyone in the congregation understood perfectly well what he was referring to, and opinion was divided fairly evenly between those who thought he was right and those who thought he had overstepped himself badly. It was the kind of division that begins in a church and spreads into the wider life of a community like cracks in dry clay. While this was happening, Myrtle Holloway was sitting beside Ira Ashford on the seat of a buckboard wagon, moving through the gold-and-rust landscape of the Ashford Ranch in the morning sun, and feeling for the first time in a very long time like she might be in exactly the right place. He had brought a blanket against the cold and a basket with cornbread and dried apples and sliced hard cheese, and he drove the team with the comfortable ease of a man who had spent his whole life behind horses. He showed her the eastern pastures where the main herd was grazing, several hundred head of longhorn cattle moving across the dry grass with a slow, enormous patience. He showed her the creek that ran along the southern boundary of the property, lower than usual because it had been a dry year, but still running. He showed her the spot where the original homestead cabin had stood before his father built the larger house, marked now only by a rectangle of stones in the grass. "My father put those stones there himself," he said, stopping the team. "Carried them up from the creek. He said it was so he would never forget where he started." Myrtle looked at the ring of stones. "That's a good thing to remember," she said. "He was a good man," Ira said. "He was quiet for a moment. He would have liked you." She looked at him. "You can't know that." "I knew him for 30 years, he said simply. "I know what he liked." He liked people who were honest about what they were and what they had been through. He had no use for pretending. She turned back to the stones. The wind moved through the dry grass with a sound like whispering. "My father was not a good man," she said. "I don't say that to get sympathy. I say it because it's true and because I've spent a lot of years figuring out what to do with a fact like that." "What did you figure out?" he asked. She thought about it carefully, the way she always did when she was saying something that mattered. That who your father was doesn't determine who you become. It influences it maybe, but it doesn't determine it. You have to choose. She paused. "I've been choosing for a long time." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the cattle moving slow and patient across the distance. "That's a hard way to live." "It's the only way I know," she said. They ate the cornbread and cheese sitting on the wagon seat in the October sun, and she told him about the dressmaking business, how she had started with nothing and built it up thread by thread, and he listened with the particular attention of a man who understood the satisfaction of building something with your own hands. He told her about the cattle markets in San Antonio and the railroad shipments to Kansas and the constant arithmetic of running a working ranch, water rights and grazing rights, and the price of beef and the unpredictable nature of Texas weather. They were not flirting, exactly. They were something more honest than flirting. They were two people who had lived enough of life to be past performance, sitting in the clear autumn light and speaking plainly to each other, and finding in that plainness something rare and good. When he brought her back to town in the early afternoon, he helped her down from the wagon with a hand that held hers a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and they both noticed it, and neither said anything about it, which was its own kind of conversation. October deepened into November, and Ira called on Myrtle every Thursday evening and took her riding every Sunday morning. The town watched with the focused attention of a community that had decided this was the most interesting thing happening within its limits, which in a town of 400 people in 1882 was not saying nothing. Reverend Cobb continued to be unhappy about it. He spoke to Ira directly one afternoon outside the post office, pulling him aside with the manner of a man who believed he was about to deliver a necessary correction. "I think you need to consider carefully what you are doing," Cobb said, his voice low and pointed. "Your family has been a part of this church for 15 years. Your reputation is solid. I would hate to see you damage it over a what?" Ira said. He was not angry exactly. He was something quieter and more absolute than anger. Cobb pursed his lips. "Over an attachment that the community finds inappropriate." "The community," Ira said, "is none of my business, and with respect, Reverend, neither is this." He stepped around Cobb and went into the post office, but not everyone was against them. Ellie Marsh, who ran the millinery shop next door to Myrtle's workroom, was firmly in their corner, largely because she had known Myrtle for 3 years and had a low opinion of men who lectured women about their worth. Josiah and Nora Alderton, who were the oldest couple in town and had been married for 47 years, expressed their approval to anyone who asked. And Marcus Ashford, Ira's younger brother, who was 29 and had his brother's dark coloring and a considerably more expansive sense of humor, turned up at Myrtle's door one Wednesday morning with a jar of his housekeeper's blackberry preserves and a cheerful message from nobody in particular that he just thought she seemed like someone who deserved blackberry preserves. She had liked Marcus immediately. It was impossible not to. He was funny and warm and entirely comfortable with himself, and he clearly adored his brother in the particular way that younger siblings adore older ones who have always been steady and reliable and there. "He hasn't looked like this in a long time," Marcus told her, settling uninvited into the chair across from her work table while she pinned a hem. "Like something good is happening to him." "What does he look like?" she asked, without looking up from the hem. "Like a man who is paying attention," Marcus said, as if this explained everything, and actually it did. In the evenings when he came to call, they had begun to talk about everything. She had read more than he had, and he knew more about the practical world than she did, and they each found in the other's knowledge something genuinely interesting. She told him about the books she loved. She had a small shelf of them, carefully selected and carried from Abilene, and he told her about the nature of the land, how to read weather in the clouds over the hills, how cattle behaved when rain was coming, what the coyotes meant when they sounded far away versus close. It was an education in a world she had not known, and she was a woman who loved learning. He found himself, on the long rides back to the ranch in the dark, replaying what she had said, turning her sentences over the way you turn a good stone to see all its sides. He found himself thinking about her during the day, in the middle of work, not in a distracted way but in the way that something important announces itself quietly at the edge of your attention and waits. One Thursday evening in late November, a cold front had come through and the temperature had dropped sharply, and when he arrived she had built the fire up high and the room was warm and amber with it. They sat closer together than they had before, not by design but because the fire was there, and the cold was outside and proximity felt natural in a way it had not quite felt before. He was telling her about a problem with one of the fence lines along the western boundary, a section that kept giving way under pressure, and the ongoing question of whether to repair it again or rebuild it properly, and she was listening with her chin in her hand, watching the fire when she said without quite planning to, "I am afraid sometimes." He stopped talking about the fence. "Of what?" She was quiet for a moment. The fire shifted and settled. "Of all of this, of hoping for something." "I'm not very good at hoping. It has not gone well for me historically." He looked at her for a long time. "What are you hoping for?" he asked. She met his eyes. "I'm not sure I want to say it out loud yet," she said. "In case it breaks." He nodded. He understood this completely because he felt it too, that particular fragility of something new and real, the fear that naming it might be what destroyed it. "Then don't say it," he said. "It'll keep." And she looked at him and thought that he was possibly the steadiest person she had ever met in her life. Not steady in the dead, unfeeling way, but steady in the way that things are steady that have deep roots and have weathered significant weather and are still standing. December arrived with cold, clear skies and the particular beauty of West Texas winter, which was not the soft white beauty of eastern winters but a sharp, spare, blue and gold beauty that could take your breath if you were paying attention. Ira had gotten into the habit of bringing small things when he came: a good piece of wood for her fire, a jar of something from the Ashford kitchen, once a book he had come across at the general store that had reminded him of something she had mentioned. She had gotten into the habit of having his preferred coffee ready and a second cup alongside it, and neither of them remarked on these habits, because acknowledging them would have meant acknowledging what they added up to. It was on a Thursday evening in early December that he kissed her. They had been standing at the door saying good night, which always took longer than it needed to because neither of them was quite ready for the evening to end, and she had said something that made him laugh, a real, unguarded laugh that she had been collecting. Each one felt like a small gift, and when the laugh subsided they were standing very close together in the doorway, and the cold was coming in around his shoulders, and the firelight was warm behind her. And he looked at her with that particular look she had come to recognize, the one that was very direct and very honest, and he said, "May I?" and she said, "Yes," and he kissed her. It was not a long kiss. It was gentle and careful and entirely deliberate, the way he did most things, and when he stepped back they looked at each other in the amber light, and she felt something that she could only describe as the sensation of a door she had kept shut for a very long time swinging slowly open onto a room full of light. "Good night, Myrtle," he said. "Good night, Ira," she said. He walked down the stairs, and she closed the door and pressed her back against it for a moment in the warm and quiet room, and allowed herself, carefully, to hope. Christmas in Harlan Creek was a modest affair, a tree in the church hall, a community gathering on Christmas Eve, an exchange of small practical gifts among neighbors and friends. Ira spent Christmas morning at the ranch with Marcus and the crew, as he did every year, and in the afternoon he drove into town and knocked on Myrtle's door. She had been invited to spend the day with Ellie Marsh's family, which she had done, and she arrived back at her rooms in the late afternoon to find him waiting on the stairs with a wrapped parcel, and the look of a man who is trying to be casual about something that is not casual. The parcel contained a pair of kid leather gloves, exactly the right size in a deep burgundy color, and a slim volume of poetry that she had mentioned in passing 6 weeks ago and then forgotten mentioning. She held the book for a moment and looked at him. "You remembered that," she said. "I remember most things you say," he told her. She had made him a Christmas gift as well, having had a feeling that he would come. It was a shirt she had made herself, in a deep navy wool, cut to his measurements which she had estimated from observation with the professional eye of a seamstress, and it fit him nearly perfectly when he held it against himself, which made her unreasonably pleased. "How did you know the size?" he asked. "I look at people," she said. "It's part of my work," he laughed. And then he said quietly and without preamble, "I love you, Myrtle." She had expected it and she had not expected it. She had known, in the way you know things that have been growing slowly in the dark, that this was coming. But the actual words, spoken in her small, warm room on Christmas afternoon with the low winter sun coming through the window, landed differently than she had prepared for. They landed solidly, like something true. "Ira," she said. "You don't have to say it back," he said. "I just needed to say it. It was becoming very difficult not to." She crossed the room and took his face in both her hands, which surprised them both, and she looked at him very carefully, taking inventory of everything she had filed away over these weeks, the steadiness and the humor and the honesty and the way he listened, and the way he laughed and the way he had stood up in that church and said the thing that nobody else had been willing to say. "I love you too," she said. "I have been trying not to for some time because I was afraid of it, but I do." He put his hands over hers, where they rested against his face, and held them there. And they stood like that in the quiet room for a long moment, the winter light slanting through the glass, both of them understanding that this was real and not temporary, and required something of them. The new year of 1883 brought with it a clarification of things. Reverend Cobb, who had spent the autumn stewing in his grievance and periodically delivering pointed sermons that the congregation had begun to find tiresome, decided in January to escalate his objections. He convened a meeting of the church council. Harold Finch, Samuel Burkett, and two other men of property, and presented his case that Ira Ashford's continued association with Myrtle Holloway was damaging to the moral fabric of the congregation, and that the council should formally request that Ira cease the association or accept a period of suspension from the church community. Harold Finch, who had been getting increasingly impatient with this entire situation, told Cobb flatly that the council had no business regulating the romantic lives of its members, and that he had no intention of making any such request. Samuel Burkett, who was more timid, said he thought perhaps a gentle conversation might be in order. The other two declined to be involved at all. Cobb left the meeting without the resolution he had sought and arrived at the conclusion that if he was going to stop this, he would have to do it himself. He called on Myrtle on a cold January afternoon, which was a thing that required more courage than he perhaps expected, because when she opened the door and found him standing there with his hat and his expression of sanctimonious concern, she did not step back to let him in. She stood in the doorway and looked at him with those gray eyes that had a way of making people feel they had been thoroughly assessed and found somewhat lacking. "Reverend," she said. "Miss Holloway," he said, "I wonder if I might have a word." "You might," she said. "Here is as good as anywhere." He was somewhat thrown by not being invited inside, which she had calculated. He adjusted his hat and began his prepared speech about her responsibility to the community, and to Ira Ashford's reputation, and to the memory of her own deceased husband, and he got about 3 sentences into it before Myrtle said, quietly and precisely, "Reverend Cobb, I will save us both some time. You have made your opinion of me quite clear to the entire town. You are not going to change anything by repeating it to my face. If you have something new to say, I am listening. If not, I wish you a good afternoon." She closed the door. She stood on the inside of it, listening to the silence, and then to his footsteps going down the stairs, and she breathed carefully until her heart stopped hammering. She told Ira about it that evening. She had not been going to, she did not want to seem like she was asking him to fight her battles, but she had learned already that keeping things from him sat badly with her, because he was the kind of man who noticed when you were withholding something and was patient and steady about it until you told him anyway. He listened. He was quiet for a moment. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to answer honestly, not charitably." "When do I answer charitably?" she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "Fair point. Are you happy here in Harlan Creek?" She thought about it. "I am happy with my work," she said. "I am happy with you. The town itself," she paused, "is a mixed picture. Would you be willing to be less mixed about it?" he asked. "If things were different," she looked at him. "What are you asking me, Ira?" He put his coffee cup down and looked at her with that direct, unhurried attention that she had come to trust more than almost anything in her life. "I am asking if you would marry me," he said. "I have been working up to it for a while, and I decided tonight that I have worked up to it long enough." The room was very quiet. The fire spoke softly. Outside, the wind moved through the empty January street. "You heard what Cobb said," she said carefully. "About me being too broken to wed, I heard it," he said. "I disagreed with it then, and I disagree with it now. A man who has never been broken by anything in his life is not someone I would trust. He might make it very difficult," she said. "He might refuse to perform the ceremony. There are people in this town who will." "Myrtle," he said, "I am not asking you what other people will do. I am asking you what you want to do." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Yes, I want to marry you, Ira Ashford." He let out a breath that suggested he had been holding it longer than he intended, and she laughed at that, and he reached across the table and took her hand, and the warmth of his grip was solid and real and exactly what it was. The news traveled, as it always did, at the speed of Harlan Creek conversation, which was to say very quickly and with enthusiasm. Ellie Marsh was delighted and said so loudly in her millinery shop to whoever would listen. Marcus Ashford, when his brother told him, gripped Ira's shoulder and said, "Good. About time," with the particular satisfaction of a younger brother who has been waiting for his older brother to catch up with what was obvious to everyone else. And Reverend Elias Cobb, upon hearing the news, announced from his pulpit the following Sunday that he would not conduct the ceremony. This was delivered not as a private refusal, but as a public statement, which was his way of ensuring maximum impact. He informed the congregation that he could not in good conscience unite in holy matrimony a man of standing with a woman whose background was, in his word, disqualifying, and that he hoped Mr. Ashford would reconsider before making a choice that could not be undone. The response from the congregation this time was more divided than it had been in October, because 3 months had given people time to form opinions, and now those opinions were fixed. There were people who nodded along with Cobb and believed he was right. There were people who shifted uncomfortable in their pews. And there were people, Ellie Marsh among them, and the Aldertons and Harold Finch and several others, who looked deeply unimpressed. Myrtle was not in the church when he said it. She had stopped attending Cobb's services after October, which was a decision she had made quietly and maintained without drama. She heard about it from Ellie by noon. She sat with it for a while. She could not pretend it didn't sting, because it did not the loss of Cobb's blessing, which she did not want, but the public nature of it, the fact that her wedding was being used as a sermon, that her life was material for someone's lesson about propriety. But she had been choosing for a long time. She was not about to stop. She went to find Ira. He was at the livery stable seeing to a horse that had picked up a stone bruise on the ride into town, and when she came through the door he looked up from where he was crouched beside the animal and read her face in the particular way he had learned to read it. He stood up. "He said something," Ira said. "He won't perform the ceremony," she said. "He announced it in church this morning." Ira was quiet for a moment. His jaw was set in a way she recognized. Then he said, "There is a justice of the peace in Millhaven." Millhaven was a town 20 miles to the east. "His name is Judge Calvin Reyes. He's a good man. I've done business with him." "A civil ceremony," she said. "As legal and binding as any other," he said, "and not dependent on the blessing of a man I've lost most of my respect for." She looked at him. "You're not angry about the church." "I'll deal with the church," he said calmly. "That's a separate matter. Right now I want to know if a civil ceremony suits you." "It suits me fine," she said. "Then let's set a date," he said. There was still the matter of the church, which he did deal with precisely and without drama. He wrote a letter to Reverend Cobb, a letter, not a conversation, because he did not trust himself in a conversation at that particular moment, informing him that he respected the Reverend's right to decline to perform the ceremony, but that he did not accept the Reverend's public characterization of Myrtle Holloway, and that if the church was going to be a place where that kind of judgment was preached from the pulpit, he and his brother would be seeking another congregation. He left the letter at the church office on a Monday morning. He also had a quieter conversation with Harold Finch, who sat on the church council and had been increasingly troubled by the entire situation. Harold Finch agreed that the Reverend had overstepped and said he would be raising the matter formally at the next council meeting. He also said that he and his wife planned to attend the wedding, wherever it was held. The wedding was held on the 14th of February, 1883, in the parlor of Judge Calvin Reyes in Millhaven, Texas, which was a modest but clean room with a good rug and a portrait of President Chester Arthur on the wall, and a window that looked out onto a street busy with the particular activity of a larger town on a weekday morning. The party that made the 20-mile journey from Harlan Creek was somewhat larger than expected. Myrtle had not expected a party at all. She had expected herself and Ira and Marcus as witness, and perhaps Ellie Marsh if she could manage the trip. But the buckboard that Marcus drove, and the 2 additional wagons that arrived at the Ashford Ranch at 7 in the morning before they set out, carried Ellie and her husband, the Aldertons Josiah riding despite his bad hip and Nora insisting on sitting in the wagon bed with a lap blanket, Harold Finch and his wife, 3 of the Ashford Ranch hands who had asked Marcus if they could come and been told yes, and a woman named Pearl Bautista who ran the restaurant on Main Street and had taken a firm liking to Myrtle when Myrtle had altered 3 of Pearl's dresses the previous spring and charged her half what anyone else would have. Myrtle stood at the window of the judge's parlor watching this collection of people arrange themselves in the room and on the chairs and along the wall, and she felt something in her throat that she had to breathe carefully around. Ira appeared at her elbow. He was wearing the navy wool shirt she had made him for Christmas, with a dark vest and his best coat, and his hair was clean and combed, and he looked, in a very particular and solid way, like the best thing that had ever happened to her. "You all right?" he asked quietly. "I did not know there would be so many people," she said. "I might have mentioned it to a few folks," he admitted. He paused. "Too many." She looked at the room full of people who had driven 20 miles in February to be here, and she shook her head. "No," she said, "not too many at all." Judge Calvin Reyes was a compact, precise man in his mid-50s with silver-streaked hair and the unhurried manner of a man who had presided over many important occasions and understood the weight of them. He performed the ceremony with a simplicity and a dignity that Myrtle later thought was more genuinely reverent than anything she had heard in Elias Cobb's church. He spoke about partnership and respect and the courage it took to build a shared life, and then he asked them to make their promises to each other, and they did, looking directly at each other in the winter light, speaking clearly and without hesitation. When Ira put the ring on her finger, a plain gold band that had been his mother's, which he had held onto for years without quite knowing why, she felt it settle there as if it had always been meant to be there. Judge Reyes said, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," and the room of people from Harlan Creek made considerably more noise than the size of the judge's parlor warranted, and Josiah Alderton was seen to wipe his eyes, and Marcus Ashford was grinning so broadly it looked like his face might not recover, and Ellie Marsh was crying openly and making no apology for it. Ira kissed his wife in the judge's parlor in Millhaven, Texas, on the 14th of February, 1883, and the world contained everything that mattered. They came home to Harlan Creek by mid-afternoon, the convoy of wagons moving along the road in the thin winter light, and there was a celebration that evening at Pearl Bautista's restaurant that Pearl had organized without asking anyone's permission, and that went on until 9 o'clock, which was quite late for Harlan Creek on a weeknight. Myrtle moved into the ranch house on the Ashford property the following week. She had not quite realized how ready she was to leave the room above the hardware store until she was standing in the ranch house kitchen, a large, practical room with a good iron stove and windows on 2 sides, and understood that she was home. She did not give up the dressmaking. She set up a proper workroom in the house, with good light and enough space, and continued to see clients from town, some of whom came to the ranch house now that she was no longer above the hardware store, and some of whom she drove into town to see twice a week. She and Ira settled into the life of the ranch with a naturalness that surprised both of them, though perhaps it should not have. They were both practical people who liked work and were good at it, and they were both people who paid attention to the world around them, and they were both, underneath the particular dignities they had constructed to survive their various difficulties, people who had been waiting for someone worth being fully honest with. Marcus lived in the foreman's house 50 yards from the main house, which was its own complete little establishment, and he was present at meals often enough to be family and absent often enough to be a neighbor, which was exactly the right balance. The ranch hands, 6 of them, ranging from a weathered man named Dex who was nearly 50 and had worked for Ira's father before him, to a young fellow named Callum who was barely 19 and learning everything, accepted Myrtle with the matter-of-fact pragmatism of working men who cared primarily about whether the household ran well and whether the cook was improved, which it was, because Myrtle had a talent for it that she had not had much occasion to exercise before. Spring came to the ranch with the particular extravagance of a West Texas spring after a dry winter. Everything suddenly, urgently green and alive, the creek running fuller than it had, wildflowers appearing in the pastures overnight, the cattle looking sleek and purposeful in the new grass. Myrtle walked the land in the early mornings sometimes, before the household woke, learning the shape of the place that was now hers as much as anyone's. She walked the fence lines and the creek banks and the long slope up to the eastern ridge where you could see for miles, and she thought that the whole of Harlan Creek looked small and manageable from up there, which she found useful. Back in town, the Reverend's situation had been quietly resolving itself. Harold Finch had indeed raised the matter at the church council, and the council had had a frank and uncomfortable conversation with Reverend Cobb about the difference between pastoral guidance and personal judgment delivered as public condemnation. Cobb had not been removed. The council did not have the authority or the courage for that, but he had been firmly advised to confine his future sermons to scriptural matters and to refrain from using the pulpit to comment on the personal situations of specific congregation members. He had agreed to this with a bad grace that everyone present recognized as the agreement of a man who intended to do as little of it as possible. A significant portion of the congregation, it turned out, had been quietly relieved by this outcome. There were people in every pew who had their own histories, their own complicated pasts, their own moments of brokenness that they had rebuilt themselves around, and who had found Cobb's particular brand of judgment increasingly uncomfortable as they recognized in Myrtle Holloway something of themselves. Myrtle and Ira attended church in Harlan Creek once more in April, which caused a certain amount of held breath in the congregation as they took a pew together. Cobb delivered a sermon on the book of Ruth. He did not look at them while he preached it, but Ruth was a woman who had been widowed and had followed her mother-in-law into strange territory and had been welcomed and had built a new life, and perhaps he had not fully thought through his choice of scripture. Or perhaps he had thought it through more than anyone gave him credit for. It was hard to know. After the service, Josiah Alderton clapped Ira on the shoulder and shook his hand, and Nora Alderton embraced Myrtle with the firm warmth of an old woman who had decided something and was acting on it, and a number of other people came up to speak to them with varying degrees of naturalness, some because they were genuinely glad to see them, and some because they wanted to see which way the wind was blowing, and found it was blowing in a direction they could accommodate. It was not a perfect resolution. Harlan Creek was not a place that was going to become perfect, but it was an honest resolution, which is what most of life offers if you wait long enough. By summer, Myrtle had taken on more sewing work than she could manage alone. She took on an apprentice, a girl of 15 named Rosa Fuentes, whose family ran a small farm a few miles north of town, and who had a natural aptitude and a steady hand, and who came to the ranch house 3 days a week, and learned the craft with a concentration that Myrtle recognized and respected. Teaching Rosa was something Myrtle had not expected to love as much as she did. It turned out she was good at it, and it turned out that being good at something you hadn't expected was one of the particular pleasures of a life that was finally giving you room to expand. The summer was hot, as Texas summers were, and the work of the ranch was relentless in the way that seasonal agricultural work always is, not brutal, but constant, requiring full attention from before dawn to after dark during the critical periods. Myrtle learned the rhythms of it alongside Ira, learned which weeks were the ones when she would not see him much before supper, and which weeks allowed for long evenings on the porch with coffee and the kind of conversation that goes nowhere in particular because it doesn't need to. She found, somewhat to her surprise, that she loved the ranch. She had grown up in cities and had lived in towns, and she had no experience of open land as a daily reality, and she had expected to find it lonely. Instead, she found it spacious in a way that felt like breathing room after years of small places. The sky was enormous. The silence was full rather than empty. The land had a personality she was slowly learning to read. She also found, and this surprised her even more, that she loved being part of something. The dressmaking had been hers and hers alone, which had been necessary and good. But the ranch was a shared project, many hands and many decisions and many small daily negotiations about resources and priorities and problems, and Ira included her in those discussions from the beginning, asked her opinion on things, listened when she offered it, which she had not expected because it was not common. She told him once that she had not expected to be consulted. He looked at her with genuine puzzlement. "Why wouldn't I consult you?" he said. "You're my partner." She stared at him for a moment. "You know," she said, "you are a very different kind of man than I was prepared for." He laughed. "I'll take that as a compliment." "You should," she said. In the fall of 1883, 1 year after Reverend Cobb had stood at his pulpit and pronounced her unfit, Myrtle discovered she was expecting a child. She had suspected it for 2 weeks before she said anything, sitting with the knowledge the way she sat with all important things, turning it over and examining it from every angle. She was happy. She was afraid. She was 27 years old and she had never expected to be a mother, had given up on the idea when Myrtle Holloway had been alive, and they had been childless for 3 years of a miserable marriage, and she had assumed that was information about herself rather than about the circumstances. The discovery that the assumption had been wrong was large enough to take some sitting with. She told Ira on a Thursday evening, the same evening of the week when he had first called on her, which felt right to her, like a circle completing. She sat across from him at the kitchen table and said directly, "I am going to have a baby." His face went through several things at once: surprise, and then a brightness that was something like joy but bigger than that, deeper, and he reached across the table and took her hand the same way he had when she had said yes. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you feeling all right?" "I am feeling entirely too well," she said, which was not quite accurate but was closer to it than any complaint she could offer. "I am a little frightened." "So am I," he said. "You are," she said, which surprised her. "Yes," he said, "enormously, but I am also the happiest I have been in my entire life, which coexists with the frightened without any difficulty." She laughed at that, and then she was crying a little, which she had not planned, and he got up from his side of the table and came around to her, and she leaned against him in the warm kitchen and felt the solidity of him, which was the thing she had come to trust more than anything else in her life. Marcus, when he was told, said finally, with the enthusiasm of a man who had been hoping for a nephew, and then caught himself and said, "Or a niece, equally wonderful, obviously," and then expressed his intention to be the best uncle in the history of West Texas, which they had no reason to doubt. The pregnancy was relatively uncomplicated, which Myrtle took as another piece of evidence in her ongoing argument with herself that things could go well, and that it was not always her fault when they didn't. The winter was mild. She continued to work through most of it, adapting the dressmaking schedule as needed, continuing Rose's instruction, walking the land on the mornings when the cold was not too severe. Ira was attentive without being suffocating, which was the exactly correct balance, and she told him so, which made him look pleased and slightly embarrassed in the way that compliments from her always seemed to. On the 3rd of March, 1884, after a long and difficult night that Ira spent mostly in the kitchen, refusing to be sent further away than that, because he said the kitchen was close enough to be useful and far enough to stay out of the way, Myrtle delivered a healthy baby boy. They named him James Holloway Ashford. The Holloway was Myrtle's choice, which Ira had agreed to without hesitation, and which she appreciated more than she could easily express because it was a reclaiming, that name, the turning of something that had been hung around her neck into something she gave on her own terms. James was born with a full head of dark hair and a startling degree of opinion about everything from the first hour, which the midwife said meant he would be strong-willed, which nobody who knew either of his parents found particularly surprising. When Ira first held his son sitting in the rocking chair by the bedroom window in the early morning light, the baby wrapped in the blanket Nora Alderton had sent ahead of the birth with the specific instruction that it was for the baby and not to be used for anything else, he looked at Myrtle with an expression she had never seen on his face before, open and undone in the best possible way, and said, "Thank you." She was exhausted and sore and perfectly happy. "For what?" she said. "For all of it," he said. "For saying yes, for coming here, for being who you are." "You stood up in a church," she reminded him, her voice tired but warm. "I think that deserves some credit." "I thought about sitting back down," he admitted, "for about half a second." "I'm glad you didn't," she said. "So am I," he said, looking down at the baby, who was asleep with the absolute commitment that only new babies and very old men achieve. "So am I." The spring of 1884 was a busy one, as springs on a working cattle ranch always were, but this one had an additional quality of fullness to it, like a room that has been furnished properly after years of having only the essential pieces. James grew with the enthusiastic speed of healthy babies everywhere, and the ranch house adjusted itself around him the way a living thing adjusts, making room. Rosa continued to come for her lessons 3 days a week, and had progressed well enough that Myrtle trusted her with full garments now rather than just alterations. And on the days when the baby needed more of Myrtle's attention than the sewing did, Rosa managed independently with a competence that made Myrtle proud. It was becoming clear that in another year or so, Rosa would have a trade of her own, and Myrtle had been thinking about what that might look like, whether there was a way to help the girl establish herself that went beyond lessons. In town, Reverend Cobb's tenure at the Harlan Creek Church was drawing toward its close. He had never recovered the uncomplicated authority he had enjoyed before October of 1882, and the constraints the church council had placed on his preaching had made him increasingly unhappy in the position. By the early summer of 1884, he submitted his resignation to the council, citing his intention to accept a position in a larger congregation in Fort Worth, where presumably the preaching conditions were more to his liking. Harold Finch came to inform Ira personally, not because it was required, but because he thought Ira would want to know. Ira received the news with a nod and said that he hoped the Reverend would find what he was looking for. Finch said he hoped so too, in a tone that suggested he was not entirely optimistic on this point. Myrtle, when she heard, was quiet for a moment and then said, "I don't wish him harm. I just wish he'd understood earlier what he was doing." "Some people have to go a long way before they understand," Ira said. "Some people never do," she said. "Also true," he agreed. The new minister who arrived in Harlan Creek in the fall of 1884 was a young man named Reverend Daniel Worth, who was 28 years old and had a wife and a baby daughter, and a forthright manner that the congregation found refreshing. He called on Myrtle and Ira in his first week, not with any agenda except introduction, and he sat in their kitchen and drank coffee and played with baby James, who was now 7 months old and had views about the Reverend's hat, and he was so clearly just a person that both of them liked him immediately. He performed the service the following Sunday on the topic of building community on the foundation of mutual regard, and he did not look at anyone in particular while he said it, because he did not need to. The whole congregation took it to be what it was intended to be, which was a statement of intent, and the majority of them found it entirely welcome. James took his first steps in the kitchen of the ranch house in December of 1884, going from the leg of the kitchen table to Ira's outstretched hands in 3 uncertain but definitive steps, and the expression on Ira's face was something that Myrtle kept in her memory the way she kept all the best things, carefully, and with the knowledge that she would want to look at it again. The following years settled into the patterns of a full life. James grew into a sturdy, curious boy with his mother's gray eyes and his father's dark hair, and a personality that was entirely his own, stubborn and warm, and possessed of a loud laugh that could be heard across the yard. He was devoted to the ranch with an intensity that pleased Ira, following his father around from an early age with the focused attention of someone filing away information for later use. He also loved to listen to Myrtle read, which she did every evening before bed, working through everything on her small shelf, and then acquiring more from the traveling bookseller who came through Harlan Creek twice a year. In the spring of 1886, Myrtle had her second child, a daughter they named Ruth. Ruth arrived with considerably less drama than James had, a quick and uncomplicated birth that left Myrtle feeling triumphant in a way she hadn't quite expected. Ruth was a fair-haired, watchful baby who grew into a fair-haired, watchful child who absorbed everything around her with large, serious eyes and occasionally demonstrated, at a very young age, that she had understood everything rather more precisely than anyone had realized. Marcus, who had declared his intention to be the best uncle in West Texas, executed this intention with considerable energy. He taught James to ride before anyone thought he was quite ready for it, which caused a brief discussion between himself and Ira that was resolved when James demonstrated that he was, in fact, completely ready. Marcus taught Ruth to play cards, which caused a rather longer discussion, and he was a regular and beloved feature of their lives in the way that good uncles always are, constant and funny, and somewhat exempt from the serious business of parenting. Rosa Fuentes, in the fall of 1886, opened her own small dressmaking shop in Harlan Creek, renting a room on the ground floor of a building on the far side of Main Street. She had saved the money herself over 2 years, and she had Myrtle's 3 years of teaching behind her, and she had a natural talent that Myrtle had recognized early and cultivated with care. The opening of the shop was a small celebration, attended by Myrtle and Ellie Marsh and Pearl Bautista and Rosa's mother and 2 sisters, and Rosa stood in the middle of her new shop in her good dress with her eyes bright and said, "I would not have any of this without you," to Myrtle, who said, "You would have found a way. I just helped it happen faster." Rosa's shop was successful. She had a particular skill with the Mexican embroidery patterns that her grandmother had taught her, which she incorporated into her work in a way that was entirely her own, and that people came specifically to commission. She made Myrtle a blouse one Christmas with embroidery at the collar and cuffs in deep red and gold thread that Myrtle wore to church, and that caused 3 women to immediately inquire where she had gotten it. The late 1880s were good years for the Ashford Ranch. Cattle prices held, the rainfall was better than it had been, and Ira's careful management of the land. He had been adding to the herd gradually and improving the grazing rotation with a deliberateness that some of his neighbors thought overly cautious, and that proved, season after season, to be right, had built the operation into something solid and substantial. He brought on 2 additional ranch hands, bringing the crew to 8, and he expanded the barn and improved the well system and built a new fence line along the western boundary, finally replacing the one that had been giving way since the year before he met Myrtle. He told her about the fence one evening, reporting it as a small satisfaction among the day's work, and she remembered the evening when he had first told her about it, sitting in her room above the hardware store in October of 1882, and she said so, and he looked at her with the slow, warm smile that she had been collecting for 4 years, and that still felt like a gift every time. "You remember that," he said. "I remember most things you say," she told him, giving him back his own words, which made him laugh. In 1888, Harlan Creek got a school building. This had been the subject of considerable community debate for 2 years, the kind of debate that involves strong opinions about where the money should come from and where the building should be situated and who should be qualified to teach. The debate was resolved in the practical way that most things in a working frontier town were eventually resolved, which is that the people who cared most got organized and made it happen. Myrtle was one of those people. She had been on the school committee for a year, attending meetings and writing letters to the county, and organizing the fundraising dinner that had provided the final needed funds. And when the building opened in September of 1888, James Ashford was among the first students enrolled, at age 4.5, which was perhaps slightly young, but he had been ready for some time. He took to school with the same focused enthusiasm he took to most things, coming home every afternoon full of information and opinions, which made supper lively. Ruth, 2 years younger, watched his school preparation every morning with an intensity that made it clear she was counting the days. Ira watched his wife at the school committee meetings, at the fundraising dinner, at the opening ceremony, and he felt a particular admiration that was different from love but ran alongside it like a companion river. She had arrived in Harlan Creek with nothing, and she had built something beautiful and useful. And now she was helping build something for the town itself. And she did it all with the same steady, direct, unassuming competence that she brought to everything. He told her so one evening after the children were asleep and they were sitting on the porch in the late summer warmth, the sound of the ranch settling into night around them. "You have made something real here," he said. "Something that wasn't here before you." She looked at the stars, which were enormous over the Texas ranch land, the kind of stars you could not see in towns with their lamplight and their buildings crowding the sky. "We have," she said. "No," he said gently. "I had the ranch. You made it into a home. That's a different thing." She was quiet for a moment. The night was warm and full of cricket sound. "Do you remember the ring of stones?" she said. "My father's markers," he said. "I went there last week," she said. With Ruth, she wanted to see where the old house was. She paused. "I told her the story about your grandfather coming from Virginia and your father building from nothing and the stones he put there so he would remember." She was quiet a moment. "I understood that differently than I did the first time you told me." "How did you understand it?" he asked. "He put the stones there for himself," she said. "But they became something for everyone who came after him, something to measure from." She looked at him. "That's what you do. You build things that become measuring points for other people." He looked at her in the dark. "You have been thinking about this for a while," he said. "I think about a great many things," she said, which was so absolutely true that he had nothing to add. He took her hand on the porch railing, and they sat in the warm night together, and the ranch breathed around them with the slow breath of a living thing that knows it is tended. In 1889, Marcus Ashford fell in love. This was the occasion of considerable family entertainment, partly because Marcus had always been of the view that women were wonderful, and that the world contained many of them, and there was no particular rush to limit oneself, and partly because the woman he fell in love with was Ellie Marsh's younger sister Adelaide, who had come to Harlan Creek from San Antonio to help Ellie during a difficult patch after Ellie's husband was laid up with a broken leg from a wagon accident, and who was self-possessed and funny and had absolutely no intention of being charmed by Marcus Ashford. This last quality, Myrtle observed, was precisely what had done it. "She doesn't find me amusing," Marcus said, arriving at Myrtle's kitchen table with the dazed expression of a man who has discovered that the rules have changed. "I say funny things and she looks at me like I've said something interesting but ultimately beside the point." "Have you tried saying something that is not funny?" Myrtle suggested. Marcus stared at her. "I hadn't thought of that," he said. He tried it. It worked. By the spring of 1890, Marcus and Adelaide were married in the Harlan Creek Church, with Reverend Worth conducting the ceremony with his usual warmth, and the celebration afterward at Pearl Bautista's restaurant went on until well past the point of propriety, which everyone considered entirely appropriate. Myrtle danced with Ira at Marcus's wedding, which was notable because they had not danced together before, there having been no particular occasion for it, and she discovered that he was better at it than she expected, and he discovered that she was much better at it than he expected. And they danced 3 dances in a row while the fiddle player earned his supper, and the room around them was full of the particular warmth of a community that had found its way to something good. "We should have done this sooner," he said while they were dancing. "We should do it more often," she replied. "Agreed," he said. The 1890s brought the ranch its challenges, as every decade brings challenges of its own kind. There was a drought in 1892 that was the worst in memory, stretching from April through October without meaningful rain, the creek dropping to almost nothing, the pastures browning earlier and harder than they had in years, the cattle requiring supplemental feeding that ate deeply into reserves. Ira managed it with the careful, unflinching pragmatism that hard years required, making the necessary decisions about the herd size with a steadiness that was not without cost to him, because he was a man who cared about his animals, and every decision to sell or reduce was a small grief. Myrtle was steady alongside him through all of it. She understood numbers and she understood difficult decisions, and she sat at the kitchen table with him in the evenings going over the accounts and the projections with the same clear attention she brought to everything. And she did not pretend the situation was better than it was, but she also did not catastrophize it, which was the exactly right balance. When he was discouraged, and there were nights when he was, genuinely, worn down by the relentlessness of the dry year, she did not offer false reassurance. She offered company and coffee, and the honest opinion that he had made the right calls and that the land would recover, and she was right on both counts. The rain came in November, late and welcome, and the creek ran again, and the grass came back the following spring with an eagerness that felt like apology, and the herd they had built back up from the reduced numbers of 1892 was actually somewhat improved in quality if not yet in size, because the process of evaluation that the drought had forced had let them keep the strongest animals. James was 10 years old in 1894 and had become a serious, capable presence on the ranch, not playing at the work but genuinely doing it, with the focused quality of a child who has decided what he loves. He had his father's steadiness and his mother's analytical precision, and his own particular gift for understanding animals, which showed itself early and only improved. Ruth, at 8, was a different kind of person, entirely social and articulate, deeply interested in people and their stories, already the kind of girl who collected every interesting thing anyone told her, and would produce it later in a context that made it relevant, which was either the making of a fine conversationalist or a lawyer, depending on how you looked at it. Myrtle watched her children with the ongoing wonder of a woman who had not expected to have them, and found herself perpetually amazed that they were real and particular and entirely themselves. She had worried in the early years about what she would teach them, whether she had enough of the right things in her to give them. She had worried about the Holloway history, her father's cruelty and her first husband's failures, whether those things would express themselves in her children despite all her choosing. She had talked about this with Ira once in the dark of an early morning when neither of them was sleeping, and he had listened and then said, "James does not look at the world the way a child who has inherited damage looks at it. Neither does Ruth. They look at it the way children who have been loved look at it. That's what they have from you." She had held on to that. In the spring of 1895, Harlan Creek held its first proper town fair. It had been organized by a committee that included Myrtle, Pearl Bautista, Reverend Worth's wife Clara, and 4 other women who had been running the practical business of the community's social life for years without anyone formally acknowledging it. There were competitions and demonstrations and music and food from every kitchen in the county, and the Ashford Ranch sent a steer for the judging of livestock, which took a blue ribbon, and Rosa Fuentes displayed embroidered garments that drew a crowd and several orders. And James Ashford won the roping competition in the boys category against children 2 and 3 years older than him, which made Ira look like he might burst with quiet pride. Myrtle watched her husband watching their son, and she thought about the woman who had arrived in Harlan Creek in 1879 with $40 and a sewing case, and a name that felt like a stone. She thought about the church in October of 1882, and the preacher's finger pointing, and the congregation holding its breath. She thought about a man standing up in the back pew and saying simply that what was being said was wrong. She thought about how much of everything that she now had, this land, these children, this life, had pivoted on that single moment when one person decided not to be quiet. He came to stand beside her while the crowd moved around them in the fair day warmth, the music starting up again from the fiddle players at the far end of the field, James already off with Marcus looking at the horses, Ruth holding Pearl Bautista's hand and asking her a string of questions that Pearl was answering with great patience. "Good day," he said. "A very good day," she agreed. He looked at her with the expression she had come to know as particular to him, warm and direct and a little amused, as if life continued to be interesting to him, and she continued to be the most interesting part of it. "You know," he said, "I have been thinking lately." "That must make a change," she said. "Myrtle," he said, and the way he said her name was still, after 12 years, something she noticed. "What have you been thinking?" she said. "That I would like to have another child," he said, "if you're willing to consider it." She looked at him for a moment. She was 39 years old, he was 47. The ranch was solid, the children were growing toward their own lives. "I have been thinking the same thing," she said, "for about 3 months. I was waiting to see if you get there." He stared at her. "You were waiting. I wanted to know if we were thinking the same way," she said. "We usually are." "We usually are," he agreed, and he was laughing now, and she was too, and around them the fair went on with its noise and color and warmth. Their third child was born in February of 1896. Another boy who came into the world loudly and with full opinions, and who they named William Marcus Ashford, the Marcus for his uncle, who was so pleased by this that he was entirely unable to speak for several minutes, which his wife Adelaide said was the quietest she had ever seen him. William arrived into a household that was already full and functional and sure of itself, and he was absorbed into it with the ease of something that was supposed to happen. James, who was 12, was gravely interested in his new brother, and took the responsibility of being the oldest very seriously. Ruth, at 10, was immediately and completely in love with the baby in the way that a certain kind of 10-year-old girl loves babies, fiercely and proprietarily, and had to be gently reminded that he was also James's and their parents' and not exclusively hers. Nora and Josiah Alderton came to see the new baby in the spring, Josiah moving slowly now with a cane, but still sharp-eyed and present. Nora held William with the practiced ease of a woman who had held many babies, and looked at Myrtle over his head with bright, full eyes. 52 years ago, Nora said, Josiah and I had our first. I thought about giving up sometimes, about whether any of it was worth it. She looked at the baby. It is always worth it. I know, Myrtle said. You have built something here, Nora said. She glanced toward the window where Ira could be seen in the yard with James, the two of them working on something together, heads bent in the same way. The two of you. We have, Myrtle said. Josiah Alderton passed away that autumn, peacefully in his own bed with Nora beside him, 49 years married, which was everything he had ever wanted. Myrtle sat with Nora through the days after and helped with the practical management of things with the care she had always given to people she loved, and Nora let her, which was its own kind of grace. The town of Harlan Creek continued to be itself small, imperfect, full of people doing their best, and sometimes their worst, and mostly something in between. New families arrived with the continuing pull of Texas land and Texas possibility. The school grew. Pearl's restaurant expanded into the building next door. Rosa's shop became an institution. Marcus and Adelaide had 2 children of their own, a boy and then a girl, who ran wild with James and Ruth and little William across the Ashford land, with the complete freedom of children who have enough space to be fully themselves. Reverend Worth's congregation grew into something genuinely warm and inclusive, helped along by Worth's fundamental decency and his wife's remarkable talent for making people feel seen. The ghost of Elias Cobb faded from the church's atmosphere over the years, the way old smoke fades from a room that has been well aired, present sometimes in a particular slant of old memory, but no longer defining the space. On the occasion of their 15th wedding anniversary, in February of 1898, Ira and Myrtle sat on the porch of the ranch house in the evening, which was mild for February, the kind of evening that reminds you that Texas winter is not entirely serious about itself. The children were inside, James 18 now and increasingly his own man, Ruth 16 with her mother's gray eyes and her own fierce intelligence, and William 2 years old and deeply asleep, which was the only time of day that young William could be reliably said to be anywhere. Marcus and Adelaide were there too, with their children, all of it spilling out of the warm house into the mild evening in the way that a full life spills out of whatever container you put it in. Ira handed Myrtle a glass of wine, which he had ordered specifically for the occasion from a supplier in San Antonio, the kind of small extravagance that still carried a little pleasure because it was not usual. She accepted it and they sat shoulder to shoulder in the way they had developed over 15 years of marriage, which was close enough to be touching, which was always preferred. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She considered the question with her usual care. "I am thinking about the day we met," she said, "in that church." "We didn't exactly meet that day," he said. "We had spoken before." "I know," she said, "but that was the day I became aware of you specifically." She paused. "The way you walked up that aisle, like you had already decided and the rest was just procedure." "I had decided," he said. "I just hadn't decided what came next." "Neither had I," she said. The evening was quiet around them, the ranch settling into the dark with its familiar sounds. Inside the house there was laughter, Marcus's distinct voice over the others, and then the sound of one of the children being reprimanded about something, and then more laughter. "Are you happy?" he asked. He asked it sometimes not because he doubted the answer but because he believed the question was worth continuing to ask. "Yes," she said. She always said it directly and without performance because it was always true, deeply. She looked at the stars which were out in force tonight, the whole enormous West Texas sky showing everything it had. "When I came to Harlan Creek I was trying to survive," she said. "I was not thinking about being happy. I didn't quite believe in it as a concept that applied to me. And now," he said, "now I think I was wrong about that," she said, "which is possibly the best thing I have ever been wrong about." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they sat in the mild February evening with the stars and the sounds of their family inside the house and the breathing of the land around them. And both of them were fully present in the way that people are only present when they know the value of what they have. In the years that followed, the Ashford family continued to grow and change and stay itself. James became, at 20, a full working partner in the ranch operation alongside his father, bringing his own ideas and his generation's slightly different perspective on cattle management and land use. And he and Ira had long discussions at the kitchen table about all of it with the particular pleasure of two people who respect each other and disagree productively. Ruth went to a school in Austin at 18. This was 1902, and the world was changing around the edges in ways both hopeful and uncertain. And she studied and came home full of the wider world and stayed connected to Harlan Creek and the ranch in the deep way that people stay connected to where they were rooted. William grew into a funny, mischievous, genuinely kind boy who was the image of Marcus in temperament and the image of Ira in face, and who had inherited from Myrtle the ability to look at a situation clearly and say the true thing about it, which was, everyone agreed, the most useful quality any person could have. Myrtle continued to make beautiful things. She continued to teach. She continued to walk the land in the early mornings and to read in the evenings and to make coffee precisely, and to speak her mind when her mind had something to say, which was frequently. She grew into her 50s with the particular quality of women who have done the hard work of knowing themselves, not without wrinkles or gray hair or the accumulated wear of a life fully lived, but with a presence and a clarity that made people feel, when they were in a room with her, that the room had improved. And Ira Ashford, who had stood up in a church on a cold October morning in 1882 when nobody else was standing, continued to be the man he had always been, steady and direct and honest, paying attention to the world around him, and to the woman beside him with the same quality of care, neither diminished by time nor taken for granted, both of them knowing that what they had was the kind of thing that required tending, and that the tending was worth it. One evening in the late summer, on the porch of the ranch house that had been Ira's father's and his grandfather's idea of a future, with the sun going down over the hills in the particular extravagance of a Texas sunset, all red and gold and too big to fully look at, Myrtle said, "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" "Tell me," he said. "That preacher," she said, "and what he said about me." She was quiet a moment. "I hated him for it. For a while I really did. But then I stopped hating him and started being grateful." "Grateful," he repeated. "If he hadn't done that," she said, "you never would have stood up. And if you hadn't stood up," she turned her head to look at him, this man who was the deep central fact of her life, "I don't know where I would have gone from there. I don't know who I would have become." He looked at her for a long time. "You would have found your way," he said. "You always did." "Maybe," she said, "but not to this." She looked at the sunset. "Not to this exact thing." He reached over and took her hand on the porch railing, the same railing they had leaned against on dozens of evenings, watching the same hills go through all their colors. Her hand was warm and familiar and entirely itself, and so was his. "I'm glad I stood up," he said. "So am I," she said. Every single day. The sun finished its descent over the hills of West Texas, and the stars began, one by one and then all at once, to appear in the enormous sky above the Ashford ranch. Inside the house, William was making noise about something, and James's voice answered him, patient and fond. Ruth had sent a letter that had arrived that morning from Austin, full of news and questions, and the particular energy of a young woman discovering the full dimensions of her own life. The land stretched out in the summer dark around them, 3,000 acres of Texas soil that had been worked and loved and worried over and built upon across 3 generations, and was now, in this moment, exactly what it was meant to be. Not just a cattle operation, not just a piece of property, but a place where a life had been made and would continue to be made, generation by generation, each one measuring from the stones the previous one had set. Myrtle Holloway Ashford sat on her porch with her husband's hand in hers, and the night coming in warm around them. And she was home, fully and finally and without reservation, in the only way that has ever mattered, which is in the kind of life that is built every day by two people who chose each other and keep choosing, who know the value of what they have because they remember what it was to be without it, who face every morning with the steadiness that comes from not being alone in the facing. The preacher had said she was too broken to wed. He had not known what broken things become when they are given time and care, and the right kind of love. He had not understood that the cracks in a person are not evidence of their unworthiness, but of their having lived, and that a life put back together by the hands of someone who sees you clearly and loves what they see is stronger at every seam than it was before it broke. Myrtle had known this, somewhere deep, even in the worst of it. She had kept building toward it without quite knowing what she was building toward, one careful choice at a time. Ira had stood up when nobody else was standing, and she had opened the door when he knocked, and they had built everything from there, in the good, honest way of people who know that a life is not found but made, that love is not a thing that happens to you, but a thing you choose to practice, every morning and every evening, for as long as you both have mornings and evenings to share. They sat on the porch until the stars were fully out and the night was entire around them. And then they went inside to their children and their warmth and their home. And the door closed behind them with the sound of everything that was whole.